as my colleague Mr. Cheshire explained, my name is Martin Hill. I'm the head of Economics, Business and Politics at Churches College. We've got a number of questions that were submitted in advance, some fantastic questions. So my plan is to get through as many of these as possible and also give the floor the opportunity to ask some questions on what Mr. Rees Mogg said tonight. Our first question is from one of our Upper Sixth Politics students, Jack Stubbings. Whereabouts are you, Jack? Microphone for Jack.
Hi. In your opinion, what would be the best response to the Northern Ireland border problem?
The Northern Ireland border problem is one that, from a British point of view, can be solved very easily. We should simply say to the European Union, we are not going to impose a border. What are you going to do? Already, the Northern Irish border has different taxes on either side of it. Different VAT rates, different fuel duty rates, different alcohol duty rates. But that doesn't need a border that is policed by customs officers. We just need to challenge the EU and say, if you want a border, put one in. Because we're not going to. And part of the problem with our negotiation is that we are negotiating as if we are still a member of the European Union and are bound by their rules. We're not. Once we've left, no one can force us to put a border in Northern Ireland. It is our decision. And if it is in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland not to have a border, and we don't want to put one up, do you really think the Republic of Ireland will put one up, even if the EU says that they should? You see, I think there is an obvious solution to this, and that we should just say to the EU, that is what we will do, or rather, what we will not do. And then the solution is at hand.
Okay, our next question is from one of our Lower Sixth Politics students, Charlie Gaisford.
Hi. If Brexit is about respecting the will of the people, why weren't 16 and 17-year-olds allowed to vote in the referendum?
Because in a general election, 16 and 17-year-olds do not have the vote. And it would have been peculiar to change it for one referendum. It was done in Scotland. It was done in Scotland because the SNP thought it would be beneficial to the nationalist cause. Whether it was or not is arguable. But with the voting age, you have to decide what your voting age will be. And that is a matter of debate. There is no right answer on voting age. There's no sort of mystical, magical answer that it should be 16 or 18 or 21 or 14 or whatever. It is just an age where society broadly feels somebody has come of age and of maturity sufficient to be involved in the future of their country. Now, I would have loved to have had the vote as a 16-year-old, and I'm not surprised that the politics students here are of that opinion too. In a way, it'd be very disappointing if you didn't. But then you have to decide, if you vote at 16, is it realistic to say you can vote but you can't buy a pint of beer or a packet of cigarettes? And that we have to decide as a nation what the age of majority is, and then logically defend it. And I accept there's an argument for 16 and an argument for 18, and I'm not particularly wedded to either age. I will happily engage in the debate. But you can't change it randomly for one election to suit one side of the argument or the other. That you have to stick with it through elections until you change it for everything.
If I may just ask a follow-up question on that, isn't there a case that a referendum is completely different to an election because it's a once-in-a-lifetime vote?
Well, a general election can be used to bind the country not formally but informally. So if you take the 1997 general election, it led to a complete reform of the House of Lords, and the 2005 election led to a complete reform of our judicial system. And these were fundamental changes that will never be reversed. So I think what is done by a parliament can have an effect of a generational kind as well. So I don't think a referendum is sufficiently different to say that you should have a different electoral basis.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Ed Raftery. Helpfully sat in a similar place.
Hello. Would you like to respond to James McCrory's comment that The government being offered help with Brexit by Jacob Rees Mogg is like a farmer being offered assistance with their chicken coop by a hungry fox.
Well, as I've tried to make clear in my comments, I fully support what the Prime Minister said on the steps of Downing Street, and what was in the Conservative Party manifesto, and was in her Lancaster House speech. And I don't seem to think that a hungry fox, when it enters the hen coop, is saying metaphorically to the farmer, I am helping you achieve your policy of fatter chickens. I am supporting the equivalent of fatter chickens, and therefore I'm not the hungry fox. I am backing government policy as enunciated by the Prime Minister, though there are some people around the Prime Minister who are trying to undermine her policy. So I'm answering them and supporting Theresa May.
Okay, we'll do one more student one, then we'll open up to the floor, then we'll go back to some more student ones. Bethany Proctor. On the front row. I think.
Does the election and actions of Donald Trump affect the UK's likelihood of negotiating a trade deal with the US, do you think?
I think Donald Trump has reiterated today or yesterday that the UK remains at the front of the queue for a trade deal, and I think that's very positive. I think it would be very good, it would be symbolically important to have a trade deal with the United States. Although, having said that, the United States is our largest single trading partner by nation rather than by bloc, without any trade deal at all. So we don't do too badly in the absence of a trade deal. So I think symbolically it is important that we should get it, and he has indicated that that is available. But I think there is a broader thing to say about Donald Trump, which is important, and that is the special relationship that we have with the United States is special for us, but not for the Americans. For almost every country in the world, its relationship with the United States is its most important relationship, because the US is the richest economy in the world, is the biggest military in the world. So if you think of the countries of the world, the Israeli relationship with the US is Israel's most important relationship. Germany's, France's relationship with the US, Japan's relationship with the US. All of these, their relationship with the US is special. But for the US, it's commonplace that countries should think the US is pretty important and worth having a relationship with. But it is overwhelmingly in the UK's interest that we get on with whoever happens to be governing the United States. We did not elect Donald Trump, we did not elect Barack Obama, but we have a duty and a national interest in getting on with whichever one of them happens to be in the White House. And if a trade deal comes from that, that is very beneficial.
Okay, would anyone like to ask a question what Mr. Rees Mogg has said tonight? Yes, sir. You got to wait for the microphone? There we go.
Do you not find it somewhat...
There's a microphone coming.
Do you not find it somewhat hypocritical to be railing against the EU as a protectionist racket when arguably Britain's own wealth was created off the back of a protectionist racket? Something that was trying to be protected by even the Labour government in the post-Second World War era. Yeah.
This isn't a planted question, but you have got me onto my favourite subject, which is Peel and the repeal of the Corn Laws. Because actually, Peel and the repeal of the Corn Laws. Because actually what happened in 1846 led to an enormous period of prosperity. And the reason it did that, and the reason this is akin to Brexit, is that it made the cost of living for the poorest in society lower and gave them more disposable income, which they could then spend on other items of consumption or on saving. And that the thing about protectionism is that you protect inefficient producers against consumers. You actually protect the rich against the poor. You protect the vested interest against those who will benefit from competition. That's why free trade is so exciting. The argument in 1846 was cheap bread. I've slightly extended that to cheaper food, clothing and footwear because they make up such an important part of the poorest in society's expenditure. And those costs are increased to them because the EU is a protectionist racket. When we really got rich was between 1846 and 1914, when we had free trade. And we ensured that we put the consumer first. We put those first who were going to benefit the most. It makes industry more efficient because industry has to compete. It means you focus on what you're really good at, the law of comparative advantage, but most of all, it makes your citizens better off. That's why we should be so in favour of free trade. And I can bang on at great length about repeal of corn laws if you want. I'll just say one terrible joke. Do you want a terrible joke? You are kind, thank you. Why are the Tories like walnuts? Because they're troublesome to peel. That's the history of the 1840s in a nutshell, just to round it off.
Okay, I will take a student one here because I think I've got a highly relevant one to what Mr. Rees Mogg just said. Archie Moffat. Just go ahead.
As a Member of Parliament for a rural constituency, how can you ensure our livestock farmers will not be undercut by cheap meat imports from countries with lower welfare regulations such as the US, such as Australia, as we begin to make these free trade deals post-Brexit?
I divide that question in two parts. First of all, we shouldn't just assume that standards in the rest of the world are lower than in the EU. A lot of EU standards are protectionist, and their aim is protectionism, not science or safety. In terms of farmers in North East Somerset, what is so interesting is what they say to me about the money they receive under the Common Agricultural Policy. They are not subsidies, they are payments to be less efficient farmers than they could be. And actually, farmers in my constituency in Somerset want to be the best farmers they can be, to be as productive as they can be, and not be shackled by EU regulation, massive bureaucracy and form filling that makes them unable to do the best job that they would like to do. So I think you should have a combination of things. You should open up the market, but you should also help farmers by putting fewer burdens on them. And I would make an exception. Not on tariffs. I wouldn't do it through tariffs. But I would say that there are things that as a country we value which are not economically viable on their own, but that which we still want to have for other reasons. So we may say that we want to have sheep farming in the hills of North Wales. But we may say instead of making lamb more expensive for everybody in the country, it's actually better to give some money to sheep farmers in North Wales to help them carry on with their livelihood. But to do it as a direct system with a direct answer. And why may we want to do it? We may want to do it because it's good for the environment. We may want to do it because it benefits tourism. We may actually find an underlying economic reason for doing it. But what we shouldn't do is make everything more expensive for everybody to achieve a different and specific and identifiable purpose.
Okay, is there another question from the floor? Yes, you, sir. From the microphone.
Yeah, hello. Are you concerned about the damage that could be done to the City of London if there's a hard Brexit and there's no deal on financial services?
Actually, precisely the reverse. My concern, and I still have an involvement in a financial services business that I set up, and on the 3rd of January we had to implement MiFID II, which is pages of EU regulations that make the city less efficient, less competitive globally. Similarly, in insurance, Solvency II has made annuities less competitive, therefore lower returns on annuities for people retiring because of Solvency II regulations, and it made the City of London a less attractive place for global insurance companies to be. They're just regional European ones, it's been fine. But speak to the Prudential about how Solvency II has made its international business less economically viable out of London, and possibly better in another part of the world. So my worry is that EU regulation is doing real damage to the City of London, and that the single market is a very marginal benefit, because most of what the city does is wholesale. If you take my business, we manage money for large pension funds in large pockets of money. They have the underlying clients, we manage the money wholesale. We don't have retail clients coming to us. And that's true for almost all firms in the city, because retail clients mainly want to deal with people in their own country anyway. They like the security of knowing exactly who the firm is that they are dealing with, because they are retail investors with the need for much greater protections. Wholesale investors are looking for the best return they can get anywhere in the world. And that is the bulk of city business, and it is not affected by EU passporting, which is basically an irrelevance. The Lloyd's of London, for example, made a great song and dance about passporting during the Brexit campaign. Shortly after Brexit, it admitted it was only 4% of its business, and it might have to move 50 people to maintain the business that it does. So no, my concern is the reverse. It's the damage that might be done by further regulation, potentially including a financial transfer tax, rather than the risk of not being in the passporting regime.
Okay, I'll take a question from the floor. Yes, at the front here. There's a microphone just there.
Thank you very much. You rather eloquently, may I add, said that we should be striving for global technology leadership. I would contest your arguments, however, and say that the issue is down to a lack of funding and our poor productivity, which is what is stifling our innovation. Between 2007 and 2013, we received 8.8 billion euros of R&D funding from the EU. As you said, the British people did not vote for the management of decline. So how will your government, a government which has cut and cut and cut, ensure that the British people and our institutions will not lose out from a very promising future due to our leaving the EU?
Well, there are 2 points. First of all, the money we receive from the EU is our money in the first place, because we have been a net contributor year in, year out, to the tune of about £10 billion a year. That's where the £39 billion settlement is coming from, because we have been a net contributor. And yes, some of it comes back to us, but nothing like the amount that we pay in. And on productivity, I don't know if you've seen recently, but the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, has just admitted that it got our productivity in telecoms completely wrong. It didn't realise that the growth in data that went through mobile telephones had been of such a level that it had shown a massive increase in productivity when their previous figures had shown that productivity in telecommunications, obviously a cutting-edge technology, had declined. So on productivity, you've got to look through the figures to understand what they really mean. And on the money, the basic point, it was our money in the first place. I would add a third thing. Most technological innovations are not made through state aid. They are made through competitive companies investing and doing things that they think will work in the marketplace. So I think it's better done by the private sector than public sector subsidy anyway.
Okay, I'll take another student question here. I've got one from Ed George. Where are you, Ed?
In the light of the result of the EU referendum, do you think that popular sovereignty should be considered as superior to parliamentary sovereignty?
Your question is really important and cuts through to the heart of how you think our constitution is set up. And I think our constitution is one where the British people are sovereign, but they delegate that sovereignty to Parliament at a general election for a 5-year period, but then expect to get that sovereignty back in full at an ensuing general election. I don't think that parliamentary sovereignty is created out of the ether, that it's just there. I don't think parliamentary sovereignty is about members of Parliament on their own. I think it's about where their power comes from. So I don't think there is a conflict. I think the ultimate authority is the British people, who have delegated their authority to Parliament, so that in a 5-year period, Parliament and only Parliament can exercise that authority, not the European Union or other international bodies. But that the British people have the right to demand that back in full at the end of 5 years. But they also have the right to vote on how their sovereignty is used in that 5-year period, if it's to be used in any way other than by Parliament. So I think there should be a referendum if there's ever a reform on the House of Lords, because that is a means of exercising popular sovereignty. I think there should be a vote, as there was, on any changes to the electoral system for the House of Commons, because again, that's how the popular sovereignty is expressed. And the view that Parliament of its own has power, I think, is a mistaken understanding of parliamentary sovereignty. It doesn't just get dropped on Parliament from God. Actually, that was the view, essentially, in the 17th century. There was the view, two views. One was that sovereignty grew up from the people, and the other that it was dropped by God onto the king and then down. I'm, on this instance, more with the Cromwellians, with the, not that it worked out well, but we'll leave that for the moment. But I think sovereignty comes from the people and goes up, rather than from the king or from God and coming down.
Okay, on the topic of sovereignty, let's have Roberta Barham's question on a second referendum.
Following on Nigel Farage's recent comments regarding a second referendum, what do you believe led such a strong supporter to change his mind?
That's very difficult for me to answer. I mean, you need to get Nigel Farage to be your guest speaker at your next event and throw that question at him. But I will answer, if I may, what I think is the underlying question on the second referendum. The first referendum was proposed in a general election manifesto. Conservatives stood saying, we will have a referendum on leaving the European Union. The government was quite clear that that referendum was the sole referendum, and the consequence was leaving the European Union, leaving the customs union, leaving the single market. There was then a second general election, where 85% of voters voted for parties that said the referendum result should be respected. The Lib Dems said they didn't want to do it, and their vote collapsed again. So, you have had two general elections and a referendum which have said that we should leave the European Union cumulatively. If people want a second referendum, they are of course entitled to argue for it. We are a free country. But to put it into law, they should win a general election campaigning to do so. And if they can do that and have a second referendum, it would be valid. But the House of Lords, for example, with no democratic mandate, to say, well, actually, we think we know best. And we think the people in two general elections and a referendum, the poor dears, they've got it wrong. If the peers set themselves up against the people in that way, it'll be the peers rather than the people who lose.
Okay, Mrs. Partridge.
My question is exactly on what we're just talking about. Lord Adonis said a few weeks ago that he intended to sabotage Brexit. I understand that the Lords are within their rights to vote according to what they believe is right. But I wonder whether there is a limit to their powers to do exactly as they please, beyond which they would be acting unconstitutionally or ultra-virus. Does their legitimacy not depend on the tacit consent of the people, which you've half answered that already?
I completely agree with you. I'm an admirer of the House of Lords. I think as an institution it works. No political scientist would ever have designed the House of Lords, and that's been true for a very long time, but it serves an incredibly useful purpose as a revising chamber. And I actually have quite a lot of confidence that I may be proved wrong. My result as a political forecaster last year was absolutely hopeless. I didn't think there'd be a general election, and then I thought the Tories would win by miles. So don't take my political forecasts as holy writ. But I happen to think that most Lords accept the constitutional conventions. And the great difficulty with Nick Clegg's reform to the House of Lords was that it said that the constitutional conventions would simply remain without being brought into law. And I never thought that was right. I think they remain when the Lords is as it is, but that if you reform it, people start again and look at new conventions. If they follow their existing conventions, which the leader of the Labour Party in the Lords, Baroness Smith, who is a very sensible person, has said that she does intend to follow, then all will be well. If the Lords go down the Lord Adonis route and decide to be Samson in the temple, they will find that what happened to Samson happens to them. He pulled the temple down on his head, for those of you who have forgotten whichever book of the Bible it is. Prophets. I don't know. Wait. Judges. Well, I'm thinking of judges. Anyway, Chronicles. Anyway, I don't know. Surely there's somebody who teaches theology here who can tell me.
We won't single them out. Is there a question from this side?
The referendum was an in-out referendum, and President Macron recently has just said that he felt that it was too complicated an issue to have it on an in-and-out referendum. Do you have any suggestions on what the referendum should have been phrased as?
We or no? That would have been sufficient, I think. I think even my French could have coped with that. Look, I greatly disagree with this view, that only this clever priestly caste of politicians can understand these complex issues, and that the poor general voter can't possibly cope. There is more good sense in most individual voters' little finger than in all 650 MPs in Parliament, that our voters can vote on 100-page manifestos to decide which party they have in government. A simple in-out answer is not that difficult. The debate was very thorough, the turnout was high, and the turnout in the Scottish referendum was one of the highest seen in decades, as people really engaged with the argument. Going around campaigning, addressing meetings, all of this, the level of questioning on the in-out referendum was intense and was detailed. People were really engaged with politics. What's so interesting is President Macron said that if the French people had had a vote, he thought they too would have voted to leave. And I think that tells you all you need to know about the European Union. It is a project of the elite, of the man in Whitehall really does know best approach to government. And we won't let the people vote because it's too complicated for them and we know best. I absolutely disagree with that. I believe in democracy. I believe in the wisdom of crowds. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, you know best what is in your interest. You collectively can put that forward. You do it in a general election and you can do it in a referendum. And for me to say that I know better and you should just be ignored is the height of arrogance. For me to put it in French is slightly more stylishly arrogant, but it is nonetheless arrogant.
I think there's another question at the front, Mr. Murphy.
Hi. I strongly agree with your position that we need to negotiate confidently and hard. I was listening to you on Radio 4, I think this morning or yesterday morning, and you seem extremely concerned about a transitional deal. It seems to me, if we want to cut the best negotiation, we do need to be prepared to have a transitional deal, but not be kind of paranoid about that ending up in a continuous staying in the European Union. I'd just like to understand a bit more about your position on that.
I think you're spot on. I think that a transitional deal as a means to an end is fine, but we need to know what the end is, and that has to be a good end. My worry is that we're having a discussion on a transitional deal that binds us completely into the European Union for a period that has not yet been determined, without any say on our future. So, the European Court of Justice, acceptance of new rules, and continued financial payments. Without our judge on the European Court, without our members of the European Parliament, without a vote on the Council of Ministers, with an end date not set, about 2 years, but not clarified, not made certain as to when it will end, and without it being at all clear what our end state will be. If I were to know that at the end of 2 years, we would be out of the single market, out of the customs union, we'd have thrown this idea of close regulatory alignment in the bin, that we would be free to negotiate with the rest of the world, that we would stop making contributions to the EU budget, that the European Court of Justice would have no further say in the law as it applied in the United Kingdom, then an implementation transition period is something that I think we could live with, even if there were bits of it we didn't like. But my worry at the moment, and why I raised those points yesterday, is because what I was beginning to hear was that we were going to tie ourselves not into the customs union, but wait for it, a customs union. Now, beware of politicians hiding behind semantics, that a customs union and the customs union are basically identical. And then where do we get the cheaper food, clothing and footwear that will benefit the British people? Where do we get the opportunity to negotiate with the rest of the world? Close regulatory alignment is a disaster. It means we become a rule taker. We become a vassal state of the European Union, having to do everything that they say with no opportunity to negotiate with the rest of the world, because why should they bother? We won't have freedom to accept their goods because we're tied into EU regulations. So transition can be lived with if it's a transition to a proper, solid Brexit. If it simply means we're then going to tie ourselves into all the rubbish that comes out of Brussels, then that's an abandonment of the vote in June of 2016. No longer quite last year.
Okay, is Molly Steele here? She submitted 4 questions. I'd love to choose one.
Hi, so which fundamental human rights laws that were put in place by the European Court of Human Rights do you believe are threatened to be removed by our government after Brexit? For example, the laws that protect trans and LGBT workers.
Well, we need to differentiate between the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights judgments do not have direct effect in the United Kingdom. We are signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights, and human rights have been brought into UK law by an Act of Parliament, and those laws are implemented then by a decision of the UK Parliament. It's a very different approach to the European Court of Human Rights as opposed to the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice, when it makes its decision, they are automatically the superior law of the United Kingdom. But the European Court of Justice is not ruling on domestic UK human rights. That is not within its ambit. It only has the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which relates to European law, not to UK law. So there will be no change when we leave the European Union to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, nor indeed to the Human Rights Act as it is in UK law.
Okay, is Fraser Pickering?
Hello. Given President Macron's assertion that the UK is not allowed to cherry pick, what sacrifices are you willing to make in order to achieve the best possible trade deal with the EU?
Well, on this, I agree with the public statements of President Macron and Mr. Barnier that what I want is a Canada-style free trade agreement, and if we can have more added on, that's great. I don't want to be part of the single market, because the single market is a regulatory trap that makes the UK less efficient in global terms. So being out of the single market is good news, is economically beneficial, and particularly it will be beneficial for competition for new companies. Single market protects incumbents from competition. That's a bad thing and makes prices higher. So I don't think it's, from my point of view, it's not a question of sacrifice. But then I'm not a pro-EU ideologue. I don't worship at the shrine of the European Union. I don't think that what it does is actually any good. So being free from it isn't so much cherry picking. What we're basically doing is spitting out the pips.
Okay, yes, sir, at the back.
You painted us a picture about what we could achieve in the future, and you focused quite a lot on the US and entrepreneurialism and economic growth. And you've also talked about the bad idea of being a vassal state, and you mentioned Norway and the bad position they have. When you look at the Economist Wellbeing Index, the US trails so far behind Northern Europe, particularly Norway, and when we look at social mobility, justice, and stress-related illness, as well as economic prosperity, Norway far outperforms the US. And of course you know this. I'm just surprised that you wouldn't have mentioned it at any stage, and you don't choose to share that information with the people here.
I think figures on well-being are extremely difficult to judge. There are some other figures that you can find on the Nordic states that show that it's not such a pretty picture if you get into alcoholism and other things of that kind. I think that you need to deal in less subjective matters. And when you look at the United States, it has absolutely amazing social mobility. that it is still a country that believes that anybody can become the President of the United States. Look, I know what you're going to say. but let me just say this about Mrs. Trump. Mrs. Trump got to the United States as a refugee, and she's the First Lady of the United States. Donald Trump's mother was a housemaid, and he's become President of the United States. Barack Obama hardly had a privileged upbringing. Nixon, not necessarily one you'd pick as a hero, was born in the house that his father built. LBJ came from some of the poorest parts of Texas. A real strong sense of social mobility in the United States, the ability of people to get on, the feeling for the American dream, is, I think, something that is really noble and exciting, and I wish we had a bit more of that here. I don't want to be a rather unexciting Northern European state. I want to be at the cutting edge of being a thriving and successful nation. And I think that's our opportunity. Norway is a wonderful country, but it's much smaller than us. It's a very different style of economy. And that's not the model I would wish to follow. And I'd be very suspicious of well-being statistics anyway. Actually, you should be quite suspicious of all statistics, particularly as we found out that as I was mentioning earlier on telecoms, the ONS has admitted that the CPI figure and the RPI figure have probably been wrong for the best part of the last 7 years. It's quite serious.
That's serious for me as an economics teacher. A question on the front here.
Thank you very much. I've been interested to listen to your talk and the way it focuses a lot on the economic prospects for the country and the countries around us. I'm interested also to hear what you just said about America. In a sense, America is the paradigm case of inequality, and as many people have made a great success of their lives there are plenty who haven't, and it does seem to be moving in a reactionary direction at the moment. I wonder what you think about the Shadow Chancellor's comments in Davos today. He said they had, the people of Davos represent a decade of austerity. The wealth of the super rich has doubled. Banks and corporations have received tax cuts, while the Panama Papers exposed tax dodging on an industrial scale. He says, my warning is this: if the current system isn't radically changed and its rules rewritten, people are not going to put up with it. Is this not the fault with the kind of trickle-down economics you're representing?
Income inequality in the United Kingdom is at the lowest level since 1985, just for one statistic. Global income inequality has collapsed since the 1980s. Why? Because China and India are engaged with the free market. The number of people on $1 a day has gone down from, over 50% in 1980 to under 20% now. This is the success of free markets. This is the success of capitalism. We have made the lives of the poorest in the world so much better than they were in 1980 when they were under the sort of regime that Mr. McDonnell now likes. That's what I say to him. And in this country, inequality has anyway declined over the last 30 years. But Margaret Thatcher was right. You do not make the poor richer by making the rich poorer. That there should be people who are enormously rich helps the whole economy to grow. It is an important part of the capitalist system. But what really matters is where everybody has got to. And just look at those figures for people who are on $1 a day's income and how that has declined, even numerically, not just proportionately, but numerically, because the population of the world has grown and fewer people are on $1 or less a day. And that is because of capitalist systems. John McDonnell's schemes were tried before and they failed, and of course who do they hit the hardest? Not the apparatchik class. They do all right. They have the special lanes in Moscow so that they can zoom about. They hit the poorest the most. So I would say to him that he is fundamentally wrong on the evidence, he's fundamentally wrong on the experience, and that what we want to do is to embrace free markets and capitalism, because that helps the poorest the most, and that was what the main part of my talk was about. So how do we help the poorest in our society? We reduce the burdens on them. The CBI doesn't reduce the burdens on them. The CBI is about making money for incumbents, keeping the rich rich. I want the rich to be richer, of course, but I want the poor to be much more prosperous. That is the main aim.
Okay, I think there's a question right at the very back. He's had his hand up for most of the evening.
Stand up because I can't sit down. Oh. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. I think your speech has been the most entertaining half an hour I've had in a long time. You've come to some really great questions. I just wanted to say that everybody's made some very good points. I own a business that is fundamentally British. We operate in the US, we operate in China, we operate in the Middle East, all over the world. So we've become practically the #1 company in the world for what we do. And it's interesting because when we get a survey post-Brexit of whether they would still trade with us, the majority turned around and said, unequivocally, and when we asked them why, they said, because you're British. And I thought that was a fantastic response. And it's interesting that you were talking about Lord Adonis and how he was going to break Brexit. Well, I don't agree with that, and I think there are breaks in the ranks of the House of Lords already. Did you see the article the other day about Lord O'Neill in the Financial Times? He made a comment that he had a foot in the Remain camp. He was staunchly Remain, and yet he's saying he got it wrong. And he said, now that he's had time to digest everything that's been going on, he said, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Britain will be so much stronger after Brexit. And it wasn't even a question, it was a statement that kind of backs up what you're saying. And I think in the course of time, we will see that what you're saying is right. And I think just wanted to say, I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I thought it was an excellent reflection of where I think we will be in 2 more years.
Can I just say thank you very much? And what that encapsulates is perhaps what underpins everything I'm saying. Whether we succeed or fail is dependent on our efforts. The thing about the EU is that people who are tied to it think that other people will do it for us. But I don't think that ever works. My business does more trade with the United States and Canada and so on than it's ever managed to do with the European Union, in spite of the single market. But you succeed or fail on your efforts, on your hard work, on your enterprise. There isn't somebody who is going to do it for you. There isn't this cosy club that will keep you in the standard to which you wish to be accustomed. It's down to our own effort, our own hard work, and the hard work of businessmen who make companies in the UK world beaters. That's what will make us succeed. So thank you very much.
There's a question right at the front here. There's a microphone.
Thank you. You said that in the negotiations we were currently managing for decline. So in that context and some of the squirming we saw yesterday at the Select Committee, do you think we have the right people in place to negotiate the best deal for us?
I'm an admirer of David Davis and a supporter of his. The government is, of course, bound by collective responsibility, and he has to defend positions that the government has taken. I think what the Prime Minister set out in Lancaster House in the Conservative Party manifesto is a really good approach to Brexit, and that's why I'm trying to help the government, as I said earlier, in supporting what it believes in. There is an issue that there are a lot of people in the UK, particularly in officialdom, who never believed in Brexit in the first place. And the heart of that is the Treasury. The Treasury came out with forecasts on Brexit, on voting to leave, not on actually leaving, but on voting to leave, that turned out to be absolutely wrong. A word of truth in them. They were politically motivated forecasts, which damaged the reputation of the Treasury. And the Treasury still seems to me to be fighting an anti-Brexit rearguard action. And I'm very strongly opposed to that. I have a feeling David Davis is opposed to that as well. And that's why I think it's important to support Theresa May, as she has to overcome some obstacles created by officialdom. So am I happy with the negotiating team? At the ministerial level, yes, certainly.
Okay, another question at the front.
You have strong views and you want to put them into practice. Both Tony Blair and David Cameron became Prime Minister without serving in the Cabinet first. Is that your plan?
No, I have no plan. What I'm trying to do, and thank you for inviting me this evening and why I'm here this evening, is that I believe that politics is about ideas and about debate, and about persuading people that the ideas you have are the important ones that will help the country and move the country in the right direction. I don't think it is about, from my point of view, holding office. I think it's about putting these arguments and hoping that not only will you engage with them, but the BBC are kindly here, and that they will be engaged with a broader audience. I would say there is one crucial difference as well between David Cameron and Tony Blair, and that is that they did what they did from out of government. I think it would be unprecedented for a party in government to have somebody who wasn't in office first. So I don't think that my name will be in the ring when this happens, if it happens. Mrs. May go on forever. She may outlive me. May Mrs. May live forever.
Okay, yes, just a question here.
Earlier you mentioned false statistics. Can you deny that voters were misinformed during the lead up to the referendum and this influenced the way that many voters voted?
I think the major issue in the referendum was the issue of taking back control. I know what you're asking about. I think you're asking about the £350 million inside the bus. The £350 million figure was not my preferred figure. I preferred the net figure rather than the gross figure. But the £350 million was the gross figure. It was a justifiable figure. And I think it was much more justifiable than whatever it was, the Treasury said it would cost us 4,000 some odd pounds each if we voted to leave the European Union. So I didn't go for the £350 million figure. It wasn't a figure I used in my speeches, but it was a good deal better a figure than some of the stuff churned out by the Treasury. And you would have thought a government department run by civil servants had a higher responsibility to be absolutely accurate and precise about its figures over anybody else. That, for heaven's sake, we pay their salaries rather than the Vote Leave campaign, which was an avowedly political campaign trying to use statistics for its argument. But I don't think that figure was itself decisive. I think what was decisive was that people wanted control of their own destiny. They wanted to make their own laws. And this is really important because at a general election, when you go to the polling station, you ought to know that how you vote can change potentially every law in the country. That there's not somebody who says, no, you can't do that. And that so many of the things that people were unsatisfied with came from the European Union's regulation. Some trivial, some important, but nonetheless a constraint on people's lives. And I think it was taking back control that was fundamental, and other things were supplementary to taking back control.
Okay, Mr. Gallagher?
Given what you've just said,
Microphone's on its way.
Given what you've just said, I understood, I might be wrong, that the government was going to have one law that brought into effect, into the British laws, all of the European laws that have been passed over the last 40 years. How selective can you actually be in doing that?
You're absolutely right, and that is what the withdrawal bill does, and I've always supported that. Because what you need is the 29th of March, this is our law, the 30th of March, this is our law, in a continuum. That if we were to have a great jag in our law over one day, that would be immeasurably confusing. But what happens from the 30th of March is that every law then becomes, subject to a transition period, a matter of internal political debate. We can decide for ourselves whether we have a tighter regulation, a looser regulation, whether we move in one direction or the other. No regulation, lots more regulation. And that's what's important, and I think it's right to do it after we've left, and then have the political debate on what laws we want and what laws we don't want, what regulations we think are important. And that just goes back to normal general election territory. My manifesto may say one thing, and other parties may say another. And then voters can decide which approach they want. It's basically the restoration of democracy. But to have tried to repeal the laws we didn't like at the same time as we were transferring the laws would have made it much more complicated to do the transfer of the laws, because we'd been arguing about the wrong things. Rather than the technical side, we'd been arguing about the detailed political side. So I think the approach of the bill was right.
Okay, moving on to the final questions now. Mr. Cheshire, would you like to ask me?
Thank you. On the subject of the EU withdrawal bill, are you at all concerned by the House of Lords Constitution Committee's comments recently regarding the so-called Henry VIII powers held within the European Union withdrawal bill that would effectively give ministers carte blanche to amend legislation potentially even beyond the EU withdrawal bill? And would you consider that to be a power grab by the executive and the cabinet?
I didn't vote for Brexit to make the executive more powerful against the legislature. I like the legislature having authority and the ability to debate. I do not like Henry VIII clauses, and I wasn't altogether sorry when the Remainers managed to amend the bill to stop some of the Henry VIII clauses going forward. So I think controlling Henry VIII clauses is a good idea. And I think that will be done by the Lords. It was already done to some extent by the Commons. There is one thing worth saying on the Henry VIII clauses. Henry VIII didn't in the end manage to do it. 1539, the Act of Proclamations is introduced. And it is, I think, the first example in our history of the House of Lords acting as a revising chamber. Because the House of Lords will not allow the King the power he wants to make all law by proclamation. They put in safeguards. And the safeguards make the bill unworkable, and it's repealed in 1547. And I think this is really interesting constitutionally, that even the most powerful tyrannical king we ever had could not rule by proclamation and was stopped by the House of Lords. And to go back to the question over there earlier, I think the House of Lords carries out this really ancient historic tradition of being a revising chamber. It will have a lot of support. If it goes further than that, it won't quite be off with their heads, because we don't do things like that anymore.
Okay, on the subject of history, there's a final history question from Isaac Hall. What about opposite historians? This is a good one.
Oh dear.
Will Brexit trade negotiations fulfil Napoleon's dream of cutting Britain off from mainland Europe, as he had wished through his continental blockade in 1806 to 1812?
It is an excellent question, and we are, of course, a nation of shopkeepers, which is a fine thing to be. Mr. Church's well-educated young gentlemen who had become merchant seamen were no doubt called over to the Navy to play an important role. On that, bear in mind they sell us £100 billion more a year of goods than we buy from them. And therefore they will want to keep the ports open so that we will carry on buying their Mercedes and their wine and their cheese and all the other things that we buy. So if they were to do that, if they were to take a Napoleonic approach, they would find that it was very damaging to them economically. And so I don't think that will happen, because it's in everybody's interest that we keep trading. Bear in mind, though we buy about £100 billion a year more from them than they do from us, that is to our advantage too, because we get products that we like. And we don't want to be mercantilist about this and think that it would be a sensible idea if we had a trade surplus with the EU. That's not the point. The point is that consumers get the goods that they want at the best possible and most efficient price. That helps the EU economy and it helps the UK economy. So I would have thought that type of blockade is very improbable. And we should remember that we are leaving the European Union. We are not declaring war, I'm glad to say. It's about saying we don't want to be part of this inefficient economic zone, not that we don't like Europe. And that's important too. And it can't be said enough, we're leaving the European Union, not Europe. Many of you will continue to enjoy foreign holidays on the continent. Many of you, dare I say, will continue to enjoy drinking champagne or claret or other wonderful products that come to us from France. and that's important, that we will still have friendly relations with our nearest neighbours and closest allies. We're leaving a financial club that became a political club, not cutting ourselves off from the continent of Europe, because we can't. And I'm glad that Napoleon is no longer... I was just thinking, Macron quite thinks he's... No, let's leave that. Napoleon is no longer alive.